I never expected to inherit anything from my grandfather. Gerald Warren and I had spoken maybe 3 times in my entire life. Stilted conversations at family funerals where he'd nod, shake my hand with fingers like dried leather, and disappear before the reception ended. So when the lawyer called to inform me that Gerald had died and left me 200 acres of farmland in Greeley County, Kansas, I assumed there had been some mistake. There wasn't. The deed arrived by certified mail, a yellow document that smelled like basement and time, transferring ownership of a property I'd never seen to a man who desperately needed a lifeline. I'd lost my job 3 months prior. Downsizing, they called it, though it felt more like drowning. My savings were gone. My apartment lease was ending, and here, impossibly, was land, property, something I could fix up, sell, and restart my life with. I drove out in early October when the Kansas prairie had already surrendered its green to brown and gold. The GPS lost signal 20 miles from the nearest town, forcing me to navigate by handwritten directions the lawyer had provided. The road narrowed from asphalt to gravel to nothing but packed dirt with grass growing down the center. Fence posts emerged from the flat earth like broken teeth, and the horizon stretched so far it seemed to curve. When I finally reached the property, I understood why my grandfather had lived alone. The barn stood in the middle of absolute nowhere, a skeletal structure of weathered wood that leaned perceptibly to the east, as if the wind had been pushing it for decades and it had finally begun to yield. The boards were silver gray with age, gaps between the slats wide enough to see through. The roof sagged in the middle and half the loft had collapsed inward, creating a gaping mouth of darkness. There was no house. According to the deed, one had stood here until a fire in 1991. But all that remained now was a concrete foundation overtaken by prairie grass. Beside the barn sat a smaller shed, its door hanging from one hinge, and beyond that, acres of stubble from harvested wheat that crackled in the wind like something brittle and dead. And in the south field, maybe 100 yards from the barn, stood a scarecrow. I wouldn't have noticed it immediately, except that it was the only vertical thing in that direction. It wore faded flannel and denim that had been bleached by sun and storm into something colorless. Its head was a burlap sack, featureless except for the suggestion of a face, stitches where eyes and a mouth might be. One arm hung limp, the other extended outward, fingers splayed as if gesturing towards something only it could see. I parked my truck near the shed and got out, boots crunching on dry earth. The wind hit me immediately, constant, pushy, carrying the smell of dust and distance. It made a low whistling sound as it moved through the barn's gaps, almost musical, almost like breathing. The shed door required a hard yank to open. Inside was exactly what I expected: rusted tools, coils of rotted rope, a workbench buried under decades of grime, mason jars filled with nails gone orange with oxidation, a manual push mower with flat tires, a shovel with a cracked handle, and on the workbench, conspicuously clean compared to everything else, was a sealed envelope. The paper was thick, aged, but not ancient. Written across the front in blue ballpoint pen in handwriting that shook slightly were the words, "To the next Warren who stays the night." Read before sunset. I picked it up, felt its weight. Inside was a single sheet of paper folded 3 times. When I opened it, I found a numbered list written in the same unsteady hand. Rules for the barn. Rule 1, do not enter the barn between sundown and sunrise. Rule 3, if you hear footsteps in the hayloft, do not look up. Rule 5, if someone knocks from inside the barn door after 1 a.m., do not open it. Rule 7, the scarecrow in the south field will move. Pretend you don't see it. I read it twice, then laughed, a short, uncomfortable sound that the wind swallowed immediately. This was absurd. Rural superstition. The kind of thing locals told each other to make boring farmland seem mysterious. My grandfather had been old, isolated, probably paranoid in his final years. These rules were the product of too much solitude and not enough human contact. I folded the paper and shoved it into my jacket pocket, dismissing it entirely. I had work to do. The barn needed assessment, structural integrity, salvageable materials, whether it was worth repairing or better torn down entirely. I grabbed a flashlight from my truck and approached the structure as afternoon shadows began to lengthen. Up close, the barn was even more decrepit than it had appeared from a distance. The foundation stones had shifted, creating gaps large enough for animals to enter. The main doors, tall enough to accommodate farm equipment, hung askew on hinges that screamed when I tested them. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old hay, rotted wood, and something else I couldn't identify. Something almost organic, like the barn itself was digesting time. I stepped inside carefully, testing floorboards before putting my full weight down. Shafts of light pierced through gaps in the walls and roof, illuminating floating dust particles that danced in lazy spirals. The loft loomed overhead, or what remained of it. Half the platform had collapsed, leaving jagged beams pointing downward like broken ribs. Old hay bales were stacked against the far wall, so desiccated they'd turned to compressed dust. Farm equipment from another era sat rusting in corners. A hand plow, milk cans, something that might have been a thresher. Everything looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I was examining a support beam for rot when I heard it. Footsteps. Soft, deliberate, moving across the remains of the loft above me. I froze, flashlight beam fixed on the collapsed platform overhead. The sound was unmistakable, the creak of weight on old wood, the shuffle of something moving from one side of the loft to the other. Not scurrying like a rodent, not the random noises of settling wood. Footsteps. They moved in a slow, measured rhythm. Step, pause, step, pause, as if whatever made them was in no hurry, or perhaps testing the stability of the boards beneath it. My rational mind immediately supplied explanations. Raccoons, possums, feral cats. Large birds, maybe. The barn was clearly not sealed. Anything could have made a nest up there, but the footsteps sounded bipedal. Human weight. I opened my mouth to call out, to announce my presence, to scare away whatever animal had taken up residence, but something stopped me. Some instinct deeper than logic that said don't. Instead, I backed toward the door slowly, keeping my eyes on the loft. The footsteps continued for another 3 or 4 paces, then stopped abruptly, as if whatever made them had suddenly become aware of me. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, waiting. Nothing moved. No further sounds emerged. Just the wind threading through the gaps and that strange, organic smell hanging in the air. I stepped back outside, and only then did I exhale. It was just an animal. Had to be. Old barns were ecosystems unto themselves, homes for owls, raccoons, snakes, all manner of creatures. The acoustics inside had made it sound like footsteps, that was all. But as I walked back toward my truck, I remembered Rule 3. If you hear footsteps in the hayloft, do not look up. I hadn't looked up. I'd kept my eyes fixed on the loft opening, but I hadn't tilted my head back to peer directly into the darkness above. Why had I done that? I told myself it was a coincidence, a self-preservation instinct. Nothing more. By the time I'd unloaded my supplies and set up a camping area near my truck, tent, cooler, portable stove, the sun was sinking toward the horizon. The entire sky had turned the color of a healing bruise, purple and orange and deep, darkening blue. The barn's silhouette grew longer, its shadow reaching toward me like a sundial marking the approach of night. and in the south field the scarecrow stood exactly where it had been all day, one arm outstretched, burlap head tilted slightly as if listening to something I couldn't hear. I made dinner, canned soup heated over the camp stove, and tried not to think about the rules or the footsteps or the way my grandfather had lived out here alone for decades. The wind picked up as darkness fell, and with it came the sounds of the prairie at night, rustling grass, the distant cry of something that might have been a coyote, and underneath it all, the constant creaking of the barn. At some point, I retrieved the rule sheet from my pocket and read it again by flashlight. Rule 1. Do not enter the barn between sundown and sunrise. The sun had set an hour ago. The barn was just a dark shape now, barely visible except when my flashlight beam swept across it. I had no intention of going near it tonight, but as I sat in my camping chair staring at the structure, I heard them again. Footsteps in the loft. Slow, deliberate, pacing back and forth in that same measured rhythm. From one end of the barn to the other, then back again. Over and over, like something restless, like something waiting. I forced myself to look away, to focus on my phone, which had no signal, and then on the stars, which were appearing in vast, overwhelming numbers across the Kansas sky. The footsteps continued for exactly 23 minutes. I know because I timed them, watching the seconds tick by on my phone, trying to prove to myself that this was explainable, that this was normal. And then, at precisely the moment full darkness settled over the prairie, when the last remnant of twilight vanished from the western horizon, the footsteps stopped. Not gradually, not with a final shuffling fade. They simply ceased, as if whatever made them had suddenly settled, as if it had been pacing, waiting for night to fully arrive, and now that night was here, it could rest. The silence afterward felt heavier than the sound had been. I sat awake in my truck for another 2 hours, doors locked, engine running for heat, telling myself I was being ridiculous. That tomorrow in daylight I'd inspect the loft and find raccoon tracks or bird nests or some perfectly rational explanation. But I didn't sleep in the tent that night, and I didn't take my eyes off the barn until exhaustion finally pulled me under sometime after midnight, slumped in the driver's seat with my hand still on the door lock. When I jolted awake just before dawn, the first thing I checked was the scarecrow in the south field. It stood exactly where it had been yesterday. Arms in the same position, head tilted at the same angle. I told myself that meant the rules were nonsense, but I couldn't quite convince myself that I believed it. Morning came cold and gray, the sun hidden behind a uniform sheet of clouds that turned the entire prairie into something colorless and flat. I'd slept poorly, fractured dreams of footsteps and empty lofts, punctuated by moments of jerking awake to check the barn through the truck's windshield. Everything looked different in daylight, less ominous. The barn was just old wood and neglect. The scarecrow was just fabric and straw. The footsteps had clearly been an animal, amplified by the barn's acoustics and my own exhaustion. I made coffee on the camp stove and ate a protein bar while creating a mental list of tasks. Inspect the barn's foundation, assess the roof damage, and determine if any of the interior was salvageable. I had maybe 2 weeks before I'd need to make a decision about whether to invest in repairs or hire someone to tear the whole structure down. By 8 a.m., I was ready to work. I approached the barn in full daylight, flashlight in hand, despite the gray morning light that filtered through the clouds. The main doors protested as I pulled them open, hinges shrieking like something in pain. Inside, everything appeared exactly as it had yesterday. Dust motes floating in the dim light, old hay bales slumped against walls, rusted equipment sitting in corners like forgotten monuments. I aimed my flashlight at the loft. The collapsed section looked even more unstable from this angle. Jagged beams protruded downward, and the remaining platform sagged visibly under its own weight. The floor up there was barely visible, covered in ancient hay and what looked like decades of bird droppings. No sign of any animals. No nests that I could see, no disturbance in the dust. I called out, "Hey, if there's anything up there, now's the time to leave." My voice echoed strangely, bouncing off the walls in overlapping waves that took too long to fade. But nothing responded. Nothing moved. I spent the next several hours working on the barn's exterior, testing boards, pulling away loose slats, and making notes about which sections were rotted beyond repair. The work was meditative, methodical, the kind of physical labor that let my mind wander while my hands stayed busy. Around noon, I took a break and walked the property perimeter, trying to get a sense of the land's full extent. The 200 acres seemed to stretch forever in every direction, flat, empty, broken only by those skeletal fence posts marking boundaries that no longer mattered. In the distance, I could see the shimmer of a paved road maybe 3 miles away. No other buildings, no signs of human habitation, just prairie and wind and that constant sense of vastness. When I circled back toward the barn, I found myself looking at the scarecrow in the south field. It was maybe 70 yards away, standing in the middle of what had once been cultivated land. Up close, or as close as I felt comfortable getting, I could see more detail. The flannel shirt was sun-bleached to almost white, buttons missing, one sleeve torn. The jeans were stiff with age and weather, held up by a rope instead of a belt. The burlap head had been stitched roughly, creating the suggestion of a face. 2 X's for eyes, a curved line for a mouth. Its right arm hung limply at its side. Its left arm extended outward and slightly upward, fingers spread, pointing toward nothing. Just an empty field and distant horizon. I remembered Rule 7. The scarecrow in the south field will move. Pretend you don't see it. Standing there in full daylight, looking directly at the thing, the rule seemed even more absurd than it had been yesterday. The scarecrow was anchored to a wooden post driven deep into the ground. Its body was literally nailed to the post. It couldn't move any more than a fence post could walk away. I shook my head and returned to work. By late afternoon, I'd made significant progress on cataloging the barn's condition. The foundation was surprisingly solid. Those old stones had been placed with care and had settled evenly over the decades. The main support beams were still sound, though the loft structure would need to be completely rebuilt if I wanted the barn to be functional. The roof was the biggest problem, missing shingles, rotted plywood, holes large enough for weather to pour through. It would take money. I didn't have to restore it properly. But the bones were good. Someone might buy the property for the land alone, and the barn adds a kind of rustic character that could appeal to the right buyer. I was beginning to feel optimistic, maybe even a little foolish for how spooked I'd been last night when the sun started to set. I'd been so focused on work that I hadn't noticed how quickly the afternoon had slipped away. Now, looking west, I saw the sun touching the horizon, turning the clouds orange and pink. Shadows were lengthening rapidly and the temperature was dropping fast. I packed up my tools and headed back toward my truck, planning to make dinner before dark. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps in the loft. I was maybe 30 feet from the barn, walking parallel to it when the sound began. The same slow, deliberate pacing, the same measured rhythm, step, pause, step, pause. I stopped walking. The footsteps continued. This time I was certain it wasn't my imagination. The sound was clear, distinct, unmistakable. Something was walking back and forth in the barn loft, and it was heavy enough to make the old wood creak with each step. I turned to face the barn, staring at the collapsed loft opening. The footsteps moved from left to right, then paused, then right to left, then paused again, like pacing, like something restless. I should have walked away. Every instinct told me to walk away. Instead, I called out, "Hello? Is someone up there?" The footsteps stopped immediately, not gradually, not with the sound of someone pausing to listen. They stopped mid-step, as if whatever made them had simply ceased to exist between one moment and the next. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to pause. I waited, watching the loft opening, heart hammering in my chest. Nothing. Then, after maybe 15 seconds of perfect quiet, the footsteps resumed, but different now. Faster, more purposeful, moving toward the loft opening, toward where I stood watching. I heard them clearly, thump, 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 thump. Crossing the loft floor, approaching the gap where the platform had collapsed. And then they stopped again, right at the edge. I couldn't see anything in the darkness up there. The loft was just a black void, too deep for the fading daylight to penetrate. But I had the overwhelming, unshakable sensation that something was standing at that edge, looking down at me. Rule 3 echoed in my mind. If you hear footsteps in the hayloft, do not look up. But I was already looking. I was staring directly at the loft opening, waiting for something to appear, to reveal itself, to prove that this was explainable. Nothing showed itself, but I could feel it there. Watching. Waiting. The moment stretched impossibly long. My neck began to ache from the angle, but I couldn't bring myself to lower my gaze. If I looked away, something terrible would happen. I knew this with the certainty of instinct, the way an animal knows a predator is near even when it can't see it. The sun touched the horizon fully now, the last direct light bleeding from the sky. And the moment it did, the moment true dusk began, the presence in the loft withdrew. I didn't see it move, didn't hear retreating footsteps. It was simply there one moment and gone the next, like smoke dissipating. The oppressive weight of being watched vanished instantly. I stood there for another full minute, breathing hard, staring at the empty loft opening. Then I turned and walked very quickly back to my truck. I didn't run. Some part of me was terrified that running would trigger something, would break some unspoken rule I didn't even know existed. But I moved fast, and I didn't look back at the barn until I was safely beside my truck with the door open and the interior light on. When I finally did glance back, the barn looked exactly as it always did. Dark, silent, empty. Except I knew it wasn't empty. That night I sat in my camping chair with my back to the truck, facing the barn, a flashlight in my lap and the rule sheet spread on my knees. I read each rule multiple times, trying to find some pattern, some explanation. Rule 1. Do not enter the barn between sundown and sunrise. Rule 3. If you hear footsteps in the hayloft, do not look up. Rule 5. If someone knocks from inside the barn door after 1 a.m., do not open it. Rule 7. The scarecrow in the south field will move. Pretend you don't see it. The gaps in numbering bothered me. Rules 2, 4, 6. Where were they? Had they been removed? Forgotten? Were there more rules I didn't know about? And why these specific instructions? What happened if you violated them? I thought about the footsteps, about how they'd stop the moment I called out, then resumed with apparent purpose, about the sensation of being watched from the darkness of the loft. Had I violated Rule 3 by looking at the loft opening? The rule said do not look up, but I hadn't tilted my head back fully. I'd been looking forward toward the opening. Did that count? Or was the rule meant to keep you from making direct eye contact with whatever walked up there? My hands were shaking slightly as I folded the paper and put it back in my pocket. Around 9 p.m., the footsteps began again. I could hear them clearly from where I sat, that same slow, methodical pacing, left to right, right to left, over and over, like something wearing a path in the floor, like something with infinite patience and absolutely nowhere else to be. I forced myself to keep my eyes on my phone, scrolling through downloaded articles I couldn't focus on reading. The footsteps continued, constant, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. At 10:47 p.m., they stopped. The silence afterward felt loaded, expectant. I waited, not sure what I was waiting for. At 11:03 p.m., I heard something else. A long, drawn-out creak, the sound of the barn's main door moving, though there was no wind. I looked up. The door I'd left half open had swung wider, creating a dark gap just large enough for a person to slip through. Nothing emerged. But the opening remained, like an invitation. I turned on my truck's headlights, flooding the area with harsh white light. The barn door was clearly visible now, hanging open, the interior beyond it a solid wall of darkness that the headlights couldn't seem to penetrate. I kept the lights on and the engine running for the rest of the night. The footsteps didn't resume. The door didn't move again. But at exactly 1:03 a.m., I heard something new. Knocking. 3 distinct knocks coming from inside the barn door. Slow, deliberate, patient. Knock, 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 then silence. I sat frozen in my chair, staring at that open door illuminated by my truck's headlights. The knocking came again. Same rhythm, same deliberate spacing. Knock, knock, knock. Rule 5. If someone knocks from inside the barn door after 1 a.m., do not open it. But the door was already open. The rule didn't say anything about that. The knocking continued every few minutes, always the same pattern, always from inside the barn, as if something was standing just beyond the threshold, in that impenetrable darkness, asking politely to be acknowledged. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I sat there until the knocking finally stopped at 1:47 a.m., and then I sat there longer, waiting to see if anything else would happen. Nothing did. When dawn finally broke, gray and cold, I got out of my chair on shaking legs and walked slowly toward the barn. The door that had been hanging open was now closed, not just pulled shut, closed completely, latched from the inside the way it would be if someone had very deliberately secured it from within. I didn't open it. I returned to my truck, pulled out the rule sheet one more time and stared at it for a long time. The rules weren't superstition. They were survival instructions, and I had no idea how many of them I'd already broken. I spent that morning sitting in my truck trying to convince myself there were rational explanations. Wind could push doors open. Old buildings settled and creaked in ways that mimicked footsteps. The knocking could have been anything. Branches blown against wood, metal expanding and contracting. The sound of my own heartbeat distorted by fear and exhaustion. But I didn't believe any of it. Around 10 a.m., I heard the sound of an engine approaching. A battered Ford pickup appeared down the dirt road, trailing dust, and pulled up beside my truck. The driver was a man in his early 50s with sun-weathered skin, work-worn hands, and eyes that seemed permanently squinted against the prairie glare. He climbed out slowly, nodded once, and said, "You'd be Gerald's grandson." It wasn't a question. "Elias Warren," I said, offering my hand. He shook it briefly. "Judd Crowley, farm about 6 miles east." He looked past me toward the barn, and something tightened in his expression. "Heard you'd inherited the place. Wanted to stop by, make sure you were settling in all right." The way he said all right suggested he expected I wasn't. "It's been interesting," I said carefully. Judd studied me for a long moment, then walked around to his truck bed and pulled out a cooler. "Brought coffee and sandwiches. Your grandfather and I were friendly. Figured I'd do the neighborly thing." We sat on my truck's tailgate, eating gas station sandwiches that were better than they had any right to be. For a while, Judd talked about neutral things, weather patterns, wheat prices, how the county had changed over the decades. But his eyes kept drifting to the barn. Finally, I said, "My grandfather left me some rules about the barn." Judd stopped chewing. His jaw worked for a moment, then he swallowed hard. "Did he?" "Yeah. They're unusual. I expect they are." Judd set down his sandwich, no longer interested in eating. Your grandfather lasted longer than most who owned this land. 40-some years he was here. That's a record, far as I know. Most? Properties changed hands 11 times since county records started being kept proper in 1891. Usually folks don't stay more than a year or two. He pulled a pack of cigarettes from his shirt pocket with shaking hands, lit one, and took a long drag. You should have burned that barn is what you should have done. But you can't afford to now, can you? Not with what land values are worth around here. I said nothing, waiting. Judd smoked in silence for a while, staring at the barn like it was a living thing he was negotiating with. Then he said, I grew up hearing stories about this place, the holdfast, folks call it. My daddy said it was here before the county was surveyed. Said the timber's black walnut from trees that don't grow in Kansas anymore. Said things happened here that made people nervous about putting it on maps. What kind of things? The kind people don't talk about directly. He flicked ash onto the ground. Gerald and I had an understanding. He'd call me if he needed help with anything outside the property line. I'd call him if I saw anything unusual from the road. But we never talked about what happened after dark. And I never ever came out here past sunset. He turned to look at me directly then, and I saw real fear in his eyes. Whatever you do, boy, you follow those rules. Your grandfather wrote them in his own blood, metaphorically speaking. Every single one of them is there because someone before him learned the hard way why it matters. I pulled the rule sheet from my pocket and showed it to him. They're numbered wrong. There are gaps. Judd glanced at the paper and his expression darkened. Those aren't gaps. Those are the rules that don't need to be written anymore because the situations don't come up. Or because everyone who might have violated them is already gone. He handed the paper back like it burned his fingers. The fact that these 4 remain means these are the ones that still matter. The ones that still get tested. By what? Judd didn't answer. He just finished his cigarette and crushed it under his boot heel. Before he left, he said something that stuck with me. Your grandfather used to say the barn isn't haunted. Said haunted implies something died and left an impression. This place isn't like that. Whatever's here was never alive to begin with, so it can't properly die. It just is. And it will be here long after both of us are dust. He drove away, leaving me alone with the barn and the rules and a deepening sense that I'd inherited something far worse than I'd understood. That afternoon, I tried to distract myself with work. I assessed the shed, cataloged salvageable tools, took measurements of the barn's exterior. But my eyes kept drifting to the south field, to that scarecrow standing motionless in the middle of nothing. Around 4 p.m., Judd returned. He pulled up fast, truck skidding slightly on the loose dirt, and got out with a grim expression. I've been thinking, he said without preamble, about what you said, about those rules, and I think... He stopped, jaw working. I think it's time someone finally dealt with this properly. Dealt with what? That, he pointed at the scarecrow. I'm tired, Elias. I'm tired of driving past this place and feeling my stomach turn. Tired of having nightmares about empty fields. Your grandfather lived in fear for 40 years. And I'll be damned if I let the same thing happen to you. Judd, it's just a goddamn scarecrow, he said, voice rising. Fabric and straw on a post. I've been farming my entire life. I know what a scarecrow is and I know what it isn't. And it isn't anything supernatural. He started walking toward the south field. I scrambled off the tailgate. Wait, there's a rule. I know the rules, Judd shouted over his shoulder. I've known about those rules since I was a boy. And I'm telling you they're just superstition. Ways to make sense of coincidence and bad luck. I ran after him, but he was moving with the determination of a man who'd made a decision and wouldn't be swayed. We crossed the stubbled wheat field, boots crunching on dry stalks, the scarecrow growing larger as we approached. Up close, it was even more unsettling than from a distance. The burlap face had weathered unevenly, creating shadows that looked almost like expressions. The flannel shirt hung loosely, moving slightly in the wind despite being nailed to the post. The extended arm seemed to point not at anything specific, but at a direction, a trajectory, like something about to gesture and frozen mid-motion. Judd pulled a pocket knife from his jeans. "I'm going to show you," he said. "I'm going to cut this thing open and you're going to see there's nothing but straw and fabric, no magic, no curse, just an old scarecrow that needs to be torn down." "Judd, please." But he'd already grabbed the scarecrow's flannel shirt and driven the knife into its chest. The fabric parted easily, old and sun-rotted. Judd ripped downward, opening the scarecrow from collar to waist. Nothing spilled out, no straw, no stuffing, no internal structure. The scarecrow was completely hollow. Judd and I both stared into the opening he'd created. The interior of the burlap body was just empty, a void, dark and vacant, like looking into a container that had been emptied long ago and never refilled. "What the hell?" Judd breathed. I felt cold despite the afternoon sun. The scarecrow should have had something inside. Even if it was rotted, even if animals had nested in it, there should have been some remnant of whatever had originally filled it. But there was nothing. Just that hollow darkness, and the faint smell of dust and something else. Something organic and wrong. Judd reached inside the cavity as if needing to confirm what he was seeing. His hand disappeared into the scarecrow's chest up to the wrist. "It's cold," he said, confused. "Inside is cold." Then his expression changed. His eyes widened. His hand jerked like he was trying to pull it back but couldn't. "Judd?" "Something," his voice cracked. "Something touched me." He yanked his arm back with a gasp, stumbling backward. His hand was fine. No marks, no injuries, but he was staring at it like it had betrayed him. "We need to go," I said. Judd nodded, face pale, and we turned to walk back toward the barn. Behind us, I heard a sound like fabric settling. I didn't look back. Rule 7. The scarecrow in the south field will move. Pretend you don't see it. We were halfway back to the trucks when Judd stopped suddenly and turned around. "Judd, don't..." But he was already staring at the south field, and I watched his face drain of color. "It moved," he whispered. "The scarecrow. Its arm. It was pointing toward the road before, now it's pointing at the barn." I forced myself not to turn around. "We need to leave, right now." "How did it move?" I cut it. "We were just there. How?" "I don't know, but we're leaving." I grabbed his arm and pulled him toward the trucks. Judd followed, but kept looking over his shoulder, muttering to himself. By the time we reached our vehicles, the sun was getting low, maybe an hour from sunset. "You should come back to my place," Judd said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Stay the night there. Get away from..." "I can't," I said, though I desperately wanted to. "If I leave, I'm admitting I can't handle this. I'm admitting the property is worthless." Judd studied me with something like pity. "Your grandfather used to say the same thing, that he was trapped. Not by the barn, but by the simple fact of owning it." He got in his truck, started the engine, then paused with the window down. "If you hear anything unusual tonight, don't investigate. Don't try to help. Don't open any doors. You understand?" I nodded. He drove away, taillights disappearing down the dirt road. I turned to look at the scarecrow in the south field. Its arm was now pointing directly at the barn's main door. And I was certain, absolutely certain, that when we'd walked away from it, the tear Judd had made in its chest had been hanging open. Now the flannel shirt looked intact, as if it had never been cut at all. That night I sat in my truck with the engine running and the doors locked, watching the barn. The sun set. The footsteps began. But this time, there were two sets. One moved with the familiar, slow, measured pace I'd heard before. The other was faster, frantic, like someone running back and forth across the loft in panic. I listened to the chaotic rhythm, steady footsteps pursuing quick, desperate ones, and tried not to imagine what it meant. Around 11 p.m., Judd's truck appeared in the distance, headlights bouncing down the dirt road. But it wasn't moving normally. It was swerving, overcorrecting, like the driver was struggling to control it. The truck pulled up beside mine at an angle and stopped, engine still running, driver's door hanging open. Judd wasn't inside. I got out of my truck slowly, approaching his vehicle. The cab light was on. The keys were in the ignition. His wallet sat on the passenger seat. His phone was on the floor, but Judd was gone. I called his name. No response. I checked the truck bed, the surrounding area. Nothing. Then I saw them, drag marks in the dirt leading from the driver's side door toward the barn. Not footprints. Drag marks like something heavy had been pulled across the ground. They led directly to the barn's main door. I followed them with my flashlight, dread building with each step. The marks ended at the threshold. The barn door was slightly ajar, darkness beyond it complete. Inside, I heard the footsteps again. Both sets, one slow, one running. Then a sound I'll never forget. Judd's voice, distant and echoing, shouting, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to, please, I'm sorry." His voice cut off abruptly, replaced by silence. Then the slow footsteps resumed, moving toward the door from inside. I backed away quickly, remembering Rule 1, do not enter the barn between sundown and sunrise. The door creaked open wider, nothing emerged. But I could feel something there, just beyond the threshold, something that had heard me, something that knew I was standing outside. I ran back to my truck, got inside, and drove away from the barn. Not off the property, but far enough that I could no longer see the structure clearly in my headlights. I sat there until dawn, shaking, trying to convince myself to call the sheriff, to get help, to do something. But what would I say? That a scarecrow had moved? That I'd heard footsteps? That my neighbor had disappeared after violating rules written on a piece of old paper? They'd think I was insane, or worse, they'd investigate and find nothing, and I'd look like a fool or a criminal. When the sun finally rose, I drove back toward the barn slowly. Judd's truck was still there, door open, engine long since died. But Judd was nowhere to be found. And in the south field, the scarecrow stood in its original position, arm extended, pointing toward nothing, its flannel shirt intact and undamaged. The only evidence that anything had happened was a single item lying on the ground near the barn's entrance. Judd's pocket knife, closed, the blade clean as if freshly wiped. I picked it up with shaking hands and put it in my pocket. Then I noticed something else. Written in the dust on Judd's truck windshield in handwriting that looked hurried and desperate. "It learns." I didn't know if Judd had written it or if something else had. But the message was clear. The rules weren't static. They weren't fixed protections. Whatever was in that barn was adapting, learning, testing. And I had just helped it learn what happened when someone violated Rule 7. I reported Judd missing that morning. The county sheriff, a tired-looking man named Porter with a gray mustache and eyes that had seen too much rural tragedy, came out with a deputy. They examined Judd's truck, photographed the scene, asked me questions about his state of mind and what time he'd left my property. I told them the truth. Judd had visited, we'd talked, he'd driven away around 4:30, and his truck had returned hours later without him inside. I didn't mention the scarecrow. I didn't mention the rules. I didn't mention the drag marks I'd seen in the dirt, which had mysteriously vanished by the time the sheriff arrived. Sheriff Porter looked at the barn with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Gerald's place always did have bad luck," he said quietly, then louder. "We'll check local hospitals, contact his family. Probably he had some kind of medical episode, got confused, wandered off on foot. Happens more than you'd think out here." He didn't sound convinced by his own explanation. They searched the immediate area, calling Judd's name, checking the barn's exterior and the shed. But they didn't enter the barn itself. Sheriff Porter took one look at the dark interior and said something about needing a warrant and proper safety equipment for structural inspection. I didn't argue. Before they left, the deputy, a young woman named Chen, said something that made my blood run cold. "My grandmother used to tell stories about this place. She called it the Waiting Barn. Said it was here before the town was founded and it would be here after the town was gone." She glanced at Sheriff Porter, who was walking back to his vehicle, then lowered her voice. "She said people didn't disappear from here. They got taken in trade." "Trade for what?" "She never said. Just told me never to come out here after dark and never to make promises I couldn't keep." Deputy Chen handed me her card. "If you see anything unusual, call immediately. Don't try to handle it yourself." Then she was gone. And I was alone again with the barn and the rules and the growing certainty that I was trapped in something far older and more complex than I'd imagined. I spent the rest of that day searching my grandfather's belongings more thoroughly. The shed contained more than just tools. In a rusted metal filing cabinet buried under old tarps, I found documents. Property deeds going back to 1891, tax records, handwritten correspondence. And underneath all of that, a cardboard box sealed with packing tape that had yellowed with age. Inside the box were journals, dozens of them dating back decades. Different handwritings, different people, all previous owners of this property, all documenting their experiences with the barn. I sat on the shed floor and began to read. The earliest entries were from 1923, written by a man named Samuel Carr. "The livestock won't go near the south structure. The horses scream when we try to lead them past. My wife hears singing at night coming from inside, though we have locked it and barred it and no one has entered for months. The singing is in a language neither of us recognize. When I asked old Henrik about it, he went pale and told me some places are doorways, and some doorways should never have been built. I have written down rules based on what Henrik told me and what I have learned myself. Rule 1, never enter after dark. Rule 2, text scratched out. Rule 3, never look directly at what walks in the loft. Rule 4, text scratched out. Rule 5, it will knock and it will mimic voices, but nothing living is on the other side of that door at night. Further in, an entry from 1956 by a woman named Dorothy Hale. We found the scarecrow moved 15 feet closer to the house. George insists it's children playing pranks, but there are no children for miles and the ground is soft from rain. There should be footprints. There are none. The scarecrow leaves no trace when it moves. George tried to remove the scarecrow last week. He took it down, dismantled it, burned the pieces. 3 days later, it was back in the field exactly as it had been, as if it had never been touched. From 1978, written by someone named Marcus Webb. I have attempted to research the origins of this structure. County records are incomplete. The earliest survey maps show this barn already present, marked with a symbol I cannot identify, like a cross within a circle, but inverted. The State Historical Society has no information about who built it or when. It predates settlement records. I discovered something disturbing in the town library. Newspaper articles from 1889 about a homestead family found dead near here. No cause of death determined. The article mentions a timber structure of unknown origin on their land. The description matches the barn exactly. I am beginning to believe the barn was not built by human hands at all, but found here, and people simply adapted to its presence. And finally, my grandfather's journals, the most recent entries from just weeks before his death. I have kept the rules for 41 years. I have lost neighbors, friends, and my own peace of mind to this place. But I have survived. The key is understanding that the barn is not evil in any human sense. It simply is. Like a river or a storm, it has patterns, behaviors, rules of engagement. Respect those patterns and you can coexist with it. The scarecrow is not a guardian or a decoration. It is a boundary marker. The thing in the barn cannot cross certain lines, and the scarecrow defines those lines. When it moves, it is measuring, testing, looking for weaknesses in the boundaries. I am dying. Cancer, the doctors say, though I know it is simply time. I have written the essential rules down for whoever comes next. I have removed the rules that no longer apply. Rules 2, 4, 6, 8, and 9 all reference situations that have resolved or entities that have moved on. What remains are the core protections. The rules that govern the thing that lives in the loft, the thing that knocks, and the thing that wears the scarecrow's shape. If I could give one piece of advice to my successor, it would be this. Do not try to understand it. Do not try to communicate with it. Do not try to defeat it. Simply follow the rules, respect the boundaries, and survive. That is the only victory possible here. I sat in the shed for a long time after reading those final words, my grandfather's shaky handwriting blurring as tears I hadn't expected filled my eyes. He had lived here for 4 decades, alone, following rules he barely understood, fighting a quiet daily battle against something incomprehensible. And he'd done it so that whoever came after him, so that I would have a chance. I owed it to him to take this seriously. That night I didn't sleep. I sat in my truck with the journals spread around me, cross-referencing entries, looking for patterns. Several things became clear. The barn was older than any official record suggested, possibly centuries old. Multiple entities or phenomena were associated with it. Something that walked in the loft, something that knocked from inside, something connected to the scarecrow. The rules had evolved over time as previous owners learned through observation and tragic mistakes. The boundaries, whatever they were, had held for a long time but required maintenance. Required someone to acknowledge them and follow the rules. Judd had violated Rule 7 by directly interfering with the scarecrow, and now he was gone. Around midnight, the footsteps began in the loft. But this time, only one set. The slow, measured pacing I'd heard on the first night. Whatever had been running frantically last night, whatever I feared might have been Judd, was gone now. There was only the steady walker, alone again, patient again. At 1:03 a.m., the knocking started. Slow, rhythmic. 3 knocks, then silence. 3 knocks, then silence. I sat in my truck, hands gripping the steering wheel, and waited it out. At 1:15 a.m., the knocking changed. The pattern remained the same, but the sound was different. Softer, almost tentative. Then a voice, muffled by the barn door, but unmistakably familiar. "Elias, son, it's me. I'm hurt. I need help." My grandfather's voice. The same rasp, the same Kansas accent, the same cadence I remembered from funeral conversations years ago. My throat tightened. My hands began to shake. "Elias, please, I'm so cold. I don't understand what's happening. Why won't you help me?" I closed my eyes, forced myself to breathe. It's not him. It's not him. It's not him. "I'm your grandfather. I left you the land because I trusted you, because I loved you. Please don't leave me out here in the dark." The voice was perfect, every intonation, every speech pattern. If I hadn't read his journals, if I hadn't known he'd been dead for 2 months and cremated, I would have believed it completely. "Elias, The voice trailed off into a sound that might have been crying or might have been wind through gaps in wood. I didn't open the door. I didn't move. I sat there with tears running down my face, listening to something wearing my grandfather's voice like a costume, trying to manipulate me into violating Rule 5. At 1:47 a.m., the knocking stopped. Silence returned. I sat there until dawn, exhausted and shaking, but alive. When morning came, I found something new nailed to the barn door. A piece of paper, old and yellowed, covered in handwriting I didn't recognize. The ink was faded brown, like very old blood. It was another rule. Rule 11. When it learns your voice, you must leave. When it learns your face, you cannot return. When it learns your name, you are already gone. I pulled it down carefully and added it to the collection I was building. The barn was teaching me in its own terrible way. And I was learning that survival here meant accepting a simple truth. I wasn't living on this land. I was sharing it with something that had been here long before me and would remain long after I was dust. Something patient, something hungry, something that was beginning to know me far too well. I couldn't stay on the property after that night. Not without answers. Not without understanding what I was truly facing. I drove into Tribune, the nearest town 23 miles west, as soon as the sun was fully up. It was a farming community barely hanging on, with a main street of brick buildings that had seen better decades, a grain elevator dominating the skyline, and a population that seemed to consist primarily of people over 60. I needed to find Martha Hain. Deputy Chen had mentioned her grandmother had known about the barn. After searching through my grandfather's papers, I'd found several references to a Martha H., who had lived in the county her entire life, and whose family had occupied land adjacent to my grandfather's property. Generations ago, the woman at the post office gave me directions with a look that suggested she knew exactly why I was asking. Martha Hain lived in a small house on the edge of town, white paint peeling, shutters hanging crooked, a yard overgrown with prairie grass that had reclaimed whatever garden had once existed. A handwritten sign on the door read, "No solicitors, no missionaries, no exceptions." I knocked anyway. The woman who answered was in her mid-70s, with steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, dark eyes that were still sharp despite her age, and the kind of posture that suggested a lifetime of hard physical work. She looked at me for a long moment, then said, "You're Gerald Warren's grandson. How did you... You've got his eyes, and you've got the look." She stepped aside. "Come in. I've been expecting someone to show up eventually." Her living room was cluttered but clean, filled with old furniture and stacks of books on local history. Photographs covered one entire wall. Black and white images of farming families, homestead cabins, and several pictures of a barn I recognized immediately. Martha saw me staring. "That barn's been photographed more than anything else in the county. Always from a distance, you'll notice. No one who goes inside likes to stick around long enough to take pictures." She gestured for me to sit, then settled into a rocking chair across from me. "You've come because something happened, something the rules didn't prepare you for." "How do you know about the rules?" "Because my grandfather wrote the first ones back in 1891 when the territory was still being surveyed." She pulled a leather journal from a side table and set it in her lap. "The Holdfast barn has been there longer than white settlement. Longer than Indian settlement, according to tribal records. The Kiowa and Cheyenne who hunted these plains considered that ground cursed. They wouldn't camp near it, wouldn't hunt within sight of it. Called it the Standing Dark." I leaned forward. "What is it?" "Wrong question," Martha said. "The right question is, what does it want? And the answer is company, presence, acknowledgement. That barn is a kind of doorway isn't the right word, more like a thinning place. Somewhere the boundary between what is and what should not be is worn so thin it's barely there at all. She opened the journal and showed me a hand-drawn map. It depicted the barn's location, but also showed lines radiating outward from it in a geometric pattern. The old settlers documented this. The barn is at the center of something, a confluence of lines they couldn't explain. Animals avoid these lines. Crops grow wrong along them. People who sleep too close to them have nightmares about things that haven't happened yet. My neighbor disappeared, I said quietly. He violated one of the rules and now he's gone. Martha's expression didn't change. Judd Crowley, I heard. He was a fool, but I'm sorry for him anyway. He spent 40 years living in the barn's shadow, letting fear make him mean. Eventually, that meanness made him reckless. She paused. What rule did he break? Rule 7, about the scarecrow. Martha closed her eyes briefly. The boundary marker, that's unfortunate. The scarecrow isn't decoration, you understand. It's a physical manifestation of the limits the thing in the barn agreed to. Agreed to? With who? With the first Warren who owned that land. Your great-great-grandfather, or maybe the one before him. The stories vary, but someone in your bloodline made a bargain a long time ago. The barn could stay, could exist, but it had to remain contained, bound by certain rules. The scarecrow marks those boundaries. When someone damages it, she trailed off. What happens? The thing in the barn learns. It tests. It's allowed to expand its reach slightly, like a tree growing new roots. Your friend Judd didn't just violate a rule, he gave the barn permission to stretch its boundaries. To adapt. I thought about the voice I'd heard last night. My grandfather's voice, perfect in every detail. It mimicked voices. It knew my grandfather. Martha nodded slowly. It mimics what you know, what you fear, what you miss. That's how it learns about you, by watching what you respond to. Every time you hesitate, every time you almost open that door or almost look up into the loft, you're teaching it about yourself, your weaknesses, your desires. How do I stop it? You don't. Martha's voice was flat, final. You can't kill it because it was never alive. You can't banish it because it has as much right to exist as you do. Maybe more, since it was here first. All you can do is maintain the boundaries. Follow the rules. And whatever you do, don't let it learn too much about you. She leaned forward, intensity burning in her dark eyes. If it starts talking in a voice that matters to you, someone you loved, someone you lost, you run. You leave that property and you don't come back until you've forgotten the exact sound of that voice. Because once it has that, once it knows what will make you open the door. She shook her head. There's no coming back from that. I sat in silence, processing this. Then I asked, why my family? Why are Warrens the ones who own that land? Because your ancestor was the one who made the original bargain. I don't know the details. That knowledge died with him. But the barn recognizes Warren blood. It knows you. That's why it's less aggressive with you than it would be with strangers. You're part of the agreement. Part of the pattern. She handed me her grandfather's journal. Take this. It has observations from 1891 through 1923. Compare it with whatever records you found. Look for the patterns. The barn operates on patterns. Seasonal, lunar, cyclical. If you can predict its behavior, you can stay ahead of it. I took the journal carefully. Is there anything else I should know? Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, your grandfather called me about a month before he died. Said he'd been having dreams about you. Dreams where you were standing in the barn, looking up at the loft and something was looking back. He said he tried to change his will, tried to leave the land to the state or the county or anyone but family. But he couldn't. The paperwork would catch fire or get lost, or he'd find himself unable to sign. The barn wanted you specifically. It's been waiting for you. The words sent ice down my spine. Why me? I don't know. But whatever reason that barn has for wanting a warrant on that property, it's not good. So you need to be smarter than your grandfather was. Smarter than all the previous owners. She stood, indicating the conversation was over. Follow the rules to the letter. Don't try to understand the barn. That's how it gets inside your head. And if you feel yourself getting attached to the property, if you start thinking of it as home, leave immediately. That's when it has you. As I reached the door, Martha called out, "One more thing. If you see someone you know standing in the south field at night near the scarecrow, it's not them. It doesn't matter how real they look or how badly you want to believe it. It's never them. The real person is already gone." I drove back to the property with Martha's journal on the passenger seat and a decision forming in my mind. I couldn't stay here. This wasn't about money or property value anymore. This was about survival. I would document everything I'd learned, pass it on to whoever was foolish enough to buy the land next, and I would leave Kansas and never look back. But when I arrived at the property, something had changed. The scarecrow was gone. The wooden post still stood in the south field, but the scarecrow itself, the burlap head, the flannel shirt, the extended arm, had vanished completely. I got out of my truck slowly, scanning the empty field. Nothing. Just stubble and wind and that lonely post pointing at nothing. I walked toward where the scarecrow had stood, every instinct screaming at me to stop, to turn around, to leave. When I reached the post, I found something carved into the wood. Fresh marks, wood shavings still pale and new. No boundaries. I turned in a slow circle, looking at the barn, the fields, the empty horizon. If the scarecrow was gone, if the boundary marker had been removed, then what was keeping the thing in the barn contained? As if in answer, I heard footsteps behind me. Not the soft footsteps from the loft. These were heavy, crunching on dry stalks, deliberate and purposeful. I turned around. 30 feet away, walking through the stubbled field toward me, was the scarecrow. It moved like a person, arms swinging slightly, legs stepping, head bobbing with each stride. But its movements were wrong. Joints bent at angles that weren't quite human. Its burlap face remained expressionless. But I could feel it watching me through those stitched X eyes. I backed away slowly, remembering Rule 7. Pretend you don't see it. But how could I pretend I didn't see something walking directly toward me in broad daylight? The scarecrow stopped moving the moment I stopped backing away. It stood there, 20 feet distant now. One arm hanging limp, the other still extended, pointing directly at me. We remained frozen like that for a long moment, me afraid to move, it apparently content to wait. Then, from the barn behind me, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice. My own voice calling out, "Help! Someone please! I'm trapped in here!" The scarecrow's head tilted slightly as if listening. "Please!" my voice screamed from inside the barn. "It's going to kill me! Help!" The scarecrow took another step forward. I ran. I sprinted across the field toward my truck, not looking back, every horror story I'd ever heard telling me that was a mistake, but unable to stop myself. I could hear the scarecrow behind me, not running, just walking, but somehow keeping pace, its footsteps steady and inevitable. I reached my truck, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. Through the windshield, I saw the scarecrow standing where I'd just been, 20 feet from my truck. Its arm lowered now, its burlap head turned toward me. Then it turned away and walked calmly back toward the south field, each step measured and purposeful. When it reached the post, it stopped, raised its arms to the sides, and went still, back in position, back in place, as if it had never moved at all. But the message was clear. The boundaries were being tested. The rules were changing. And I was running out of time to figure out what the barn truly wanted from me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my truck with every light on, engine running, eyes fixed on the barn and the scarecrow in the south field. Both remained motionless, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were aware of me, watching, waiting for me to make a mistake. I'd spent the afternoon reading through Martha Haynes' grandfather's journal, cross-referencing it with my own grandfather's notes and the earlier accounts I'd found. A pattern was emerging, a terrible, inexorable pattern. The barn operated in cycles. Every few decades it would test its boundaries more aggressively, usually triggered by a violation of the rules or a change in ownership. During these testing periods, the phenomena would escalate. The footsteps would grow louder, the knocking more insistent, the scarecrow more active, and someone would disappear. Always someone who violated a rule, always someone who refused to believe. The cycle would peak, claim its victim, and then subside for years. The barn would return to its dormant state, content with its boundaries, satisfied with its tribute, until the next time. I was living through a peak period. I could feel it. Judd's disappearance had been the trigger, and now the barn was pushing harder, testing me specifically, trying to determine how far it could go. The question that kept me awake wasn't whether I could survive this. It was whether I should be trying to survive at all. Because here's what I'd learned from all those journals. Everyone who survived the barn eventually became its accomplice. They survived by following the rules, yes, but also by passing the burden on to someone else. By staying just long enough to document the patterns, to write down the rules, and then to leave the property to the next victim. My grandfather had survived 41 years by doing exactly that. He'd followed the rules perfectly, never once violated them, and in return he'd lived in quiet terror and eventual isolation, knowing that one day he'd pass this curse on to me. He'd known. The dreams Martha mentioned proved he'd known the barn was waiting for me specifically, and he'd done it anyway. I could do the same. I could follow the rules, maintain the boundaries, and eventually, when I was old and tired and desperate, I could pass the deed on to someone else. Maybe a child who didn't exist yet. Maybe a niece or nephew. Maybe a stranger who answered a too-good-to-be-true classified ad. I could survive by becoming complicit, or I could break the cycle right now. Around sunset, storm clouds moved in from the west, massive thunderheads stacking up on the horizon, bruised purple and churning with internal lightning. The wind picked up, pushing against my truck hard enough to rock it gently on its suspension. This was going to be a bad storm, the kind that made the prairie feel apocalyptic. I checked the barn. Still standing, still silent. The scarecrow in the south field seemed to lean into the wind, but didn't move otherwise. I ate a cold dinner from cans and watched the darkness descend faster than usual, pulled down early by the storm clouds. The first raindrops hit my windshield at 7:47 p.m., fat, heavy drops that exploded on impact. Within minutes, it was a downpour, visibility reduced to maybe 15 feet. Lightning cracked across the sky, illuminating the barn in stark white flashes. I saw something during one of those flashes. The barn door, which had been closed all day, was open, not just slightly ajar. Fully open, swinging gently in the wind, the interior beyond it a solid wall of darkness that even lightning couldn't penetrate. The footsteps began at 8:03 p.m., earlier than usual. I could hear them even over the sound of rain hammering on my truck's roof. That slow, measured pacing in the loft. But louder now, heavier, like something that no longer needed to pretend it was constrained by the barn structure. At 9:15 p.m., the knocking started, but not from inside the barn door. It came from my truck's rear window. I spun around, heart exploding in my chest. Through the rain-streaked glass, I saw nothing, just darkness and weather. The knocking came again. 3 deliberate impacts on the glass, the same rhythm I'd heard from inside the barn door. Knock, 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 then silence. Lightning flashed, and for a split second I saw it. A figure standing behind my truck. Tall, thin, wrong. Darkness returned before I could process details. The knocking came from my driver's side window now. I didn't look. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, hands gripping the steering wheel, breath coming in short gasps. Elias. A voice from right outside my window, speaking softly, intimately, as if the speaker's mouth was pressed against the glass. Why won't you help us? It was Judd's voice, but wrong, hollow, like someone imitating speech without understanding what the words meant. We're so cold out here, so lonely. Just open the door, Elias. Let us in where it's warm. I closed my eyes. You're not Judd. Of course I am. The voice sounded hurt, offended. You saw what happened to me. You let it happen. The least you could do is let me come inside now. Judd is gone. You're not him. How do you know? The voice was changing now, shifting into something else. Something older. How do you know I'm not the part of him that's left? The part that's still aware, still suffering, still begging for help? I didn't answer. Elias. My grandfather's voice now, speaking from the passenger side window. Son, I'm so disappointed in you. My eyes opened involuntarily. Through the rain-smeared window, I saw a figure standing beside my truck. It wore clothes like my grandfather used to wear, flannel shirt, denim overalls, work boots. But its proportions were wrong, limbs too long, head tilted at an angle that would break a human neck. I left you everything, the voice continued. I trusted you with the legacy, and you're just sitting here afraid. Your grandmother would be ashamed. Something in me snapped. Shut up, I whispered. Elias! Shut up, I screamed it. You're not my grandfather. You're not Judd. You're just a thing that mimics and manipulates and pretends, but you're not real. Silence fell. Even the rain seemed to quiet momentarily. Then laughter came from all around my truck, not cruel laughter, but genuinely amused, almost fond. Oh, Elias, said a voice I didn't recognize, sexless and ageless. Of course we're real. We're more real than you could possibly understand. We were here before your species learned to make fire. We'll be here after your last city crumbles into dust. The question isn't whether we're real. The question is whether you'll let us in. The knocking resumed on every window simultaneously. Driver's side, passenger side, rear window, windshield, a dozen hands hammering on glass in perfect rhythm. Knock, knock, knock. My truck rocked with the force of it. Knock, knock, knock. The windshield began to crack, a spiderweb of fissures spreading from the center. Knock, knock, knock. Stop, I screamed. Stop it! The knocking ceased instantly. Silence again except for the rain. Then that ageless voice spoke once more, very softly. Come to the barn, Elias. Come inside. We'll answer all your questions. We'll show you everything. You just have to open the door. No. It's past 1 a.m. now. I checked my phone. It was 1:03. You know what that means. Rule 5. If someone knocks from inside the barn door after 1 a.m., do not open it. But we're not knocking from inside the barn door anymore, are we? We're out here. With you. Lightning flashed again, and I saw them. Figures surrounding my truck, dozens of them. Some shaped almost like people. Others wrong in ways I couldn't process. Geometries that hurt to look at. All standing perfectly still in the pouring rain. All watching me. The rules are changing, Elias, the voice said. We've learned so much from you, from Judd, from all the others who came before. We're expanding, growing. Soon we won't need the barn at all. Soon we'll walk as far as we want, and it's all thanks to you." "I haven't done anything, haven't you?" The voice sounded amused again. "You've acknowledged us, feared us, given us power through your belief. Every time you followed the rules, you reinforced our existence. Every time you looked at the barn with dread, you fed us. You've been helping us all along." I realized with horror that it was right. The rules weren't protection, they were a form of worship. A way of acknowledging the barn's power, of respecting its authority, of participating in its existence. By following the rules, I'd been making it stronger. "What do you want?" I asked finally. "The same thing every living thing wants," the voice replied. "To continue, to grow, to not be alone. The barn is lonely, Elias. It's been here so long, waiting, reaching out, trying to connect. All it wants is company. All it wants is for someone to finally open the door and step inside willingly, to join it, to stay. What happens if I do? You'll understand everything. You'll become part of something ancient and vast. You'll never be alone again. Isn't that what everyone wants? To belong?" I looked at the figures surrounding my truck, at the barn's open door still swinging in the wind, at the scarecrow in the south field which was now facing my truck despite the storm. And I made a decision. "No," I said firmly. "I won't open the door, I won't come inside, I won't follow the rules anymore, but I also won't give you what you want. I'm leaving, right now. And I'm never coming back." The laughter that erupted from all around my truck was deafening, louder than the thunder. "You can't leave, Elias. This land is yours. The deed is in your name. The burden is yours to carry. That's how the covenant works. A warren on this land until the warren line dies out. That was the bargain. Then I'll sell it. I'll sign the deed over to the state, to anyone. And doom them? Condemn some innocent stranger to what you've experienced? Could you live with that?" I hesitated. That was the trap, I realized. The moral snare that had kept my grandfather here for 4 decades. The knowledge that leaving meant passing the curse on to someone else. Someone who wouldn't have the rules, wouldn't have the warnings, wouldn't have a chance. "You see," the voice said softly, "you're a good person, Elias. Too good. That's why you'll stay. That's why you'll all always stay." But I thought about Judd, about all the previous owners who disappeared or died or gone mad, about my grandfather's final years lived in fear and isolation. And I realized something. Staying made it stronger. Surviving made it stronger. Following the rules made it stronger. The only way to weaken it was to break the cycle entirely. "You're right," I said. "I won't sell it. I won't pass it on." I started the engine. "What are you doing?" "Something someone should have done a century ago." I put the truck in drive and aimed it directly at the barn. The figures scattered as I accelerated, dissolving into rain and shadow like they'd never been solid at all. My truck's headlights carved through the storm, illuminating the barn's open door. That rectangle of absolute darkness that even the high beams couldn't penetrate. I pressed the accelerator harder. The truck bounced over uneven ground, engine roaring, windshield wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. The barn grew larger, filling my vision, and for a moment I saw it not as it was now, but as it must have been centuries ago. Timber raised by hands that understood geometry that shouldn't work. Angles that defied natural law. A structure built to serve a purpose that had nothing to do with shelter. At the last second, I veered sharply left. I wasn't suicidal. I wasn't going to ram the barn and hope the impact somehow destroyed whatever lived inside. That was the kind of dramatic gesture that felt right but accomplished nothing. Instead, I skidded to a stop beside the barn and jumped out of the truck into the pouring rain. The storm hit me like a physical force, wind and water and electricity in the air. Lightning cracked overhead so close I felt the percussion in my chest. Thunder followed immediately, deafening. I ran to the barn door, standing just outside that threshold, staring into the darkness within. "You want me to come inside?" I shouted over the storm. "You want me to join you? Here I am." Nothing responded. The darkness remained absolute. "Come on!" I screamed. "Show yourself. Stop hiding behind voices and shadows. If you're real, if you're ancient, if you're powerful, then face me." The wind died suddenly. Completely. The rain stopped as if someone had closed a faucet. The silence was more terrifying than the storm had been. I stood at the barn's threshold, soaking wet, shaking with cold and adrenaline, staring into that darkness. And slowly something began to take shape inside, not emerging from the darkness, assembling within it. Like puzzle pieces being put together by invisible hands, a form constructed from nothing. It was tall, at least 7 feet. It had the outline of a human figure, but the proportions were wrong in every way. Arms too long, reaching almost to the ground. Legs that bent in too many places. A torso that seemed to shift between concave and convex depending on the angle. And a head that tilted too far to one side, as if the neck had no structure at all. 2 points of light appeared where eyes should be. Not red, that would have been too expected, too much like a horror movie. These were pale yellow, the color of old bone. The thing stepped forward into the barn's doorway, and reality seemed to bend around it. The darkness clung to its form like oil, dripping and reforming, never fully leaving it visible. When it spoke, the voice came from everywhere and nowhere. "You wanted to see, now you see." "What are you?" My voice was steadier than I expected. "We are the space between. The gap where nothing should exist but does anyway. We are the price of reality, the shadow every solid thing casts, the silence every sound requires. You cannot have light without dark, life without death, presence without absence. We are the absence made manifest. Why this barn? Why this place? We did not choose this place. This place chose us. The geometry here is wrong, was always wrong. The Earth's surface buckled here millennia ago, created an angle that should not exist in 3-dimensional space. We slipped through. And because we are here, we will always be here. Geography is permanent. Lightning flashed behind me, illuminating the barn's interior for a split second. In that moment of light, I saw the loft and what waited there. Dozens of figures, hundreds maybe. All standing perfectly still, all shapes wrong. All facing the opening where I stood. An audience, a congregation, all watching with those pale yellow eyes. Darkness returned. "You want to break the cycle," the thing said. It wasn't a question. "You want to end this." "Yes. You cannot. We existed before your species. We will exist after. The barn is simply where we are focused now, but we are everywhere that geometry fails. Every basement that's slightly too large. Every room where shadows fall at wrong angles. Every road that seems longer than it should be. We are in all those places, waiting, watching. You cannot destroy us. But I can stop feeding you." The thing tilted its head further, that impossible angle that made my eyes hurt. "Explain. The rules, the fear, the acknowledgement. That's what gives you power here. Not the barn itself, but people believing in the barn. Respecting it. Following instructions written by people who were too afraid to do anything else. Every owner who survived did so by validating your existence. By treating the rules as sacred. That's the covenant you mentioned, isn't it? Not a bargain made by my ancestor, but a psychological trap. You need us to believe in you." The silence that followed was different, uncertain. "The Warren line is not special," I continued, understanding flooding through me. "Any owner would do. But the pattern of passing it through inheritance, through family, through documented rules, that creates belief. That creates tradition, and tradition creates power. You understand more than your predecessors. The thing's voice held something that might have been respect. But understanding changes nothing. You are here. You have seen us. You have spoken with us. You cannot pretend we do not exist now. I'm not going to pretend you don't exist. I'm going to stop caring that you do. I pulled out my phone. Miraculously, it had survived the rain, and opened the camera. The thing recoiled slightly. What are you doing? Documenting you, I said. You exist in fear and mystery and isolation, in rules that can't be questioned, in stories whispered, not spoken aloud. But what happens when I take your picture? When I post it online? When I make you mundane? I snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the barn interior for a fraction of a second. In that moment, I saw the thing clearly, and it was diminished, smaller, less coherent, like something that depended on being unseen to maintain its form. When I tell your story not as horror but as fact, I continued, when I reduce you to documentation and evidence and testimony, you become just another phenomenon. Unexplained, yes. Strange, yes. But not sacred, not special, just there. Like ball lightning or deep-sea creatures. Weird but knowable. The thing let out a sound I'd never heard before. Something between wind through a crack and an animal in pain. You cannot. I already have. I took another photo. And tomorrow I'll call researchers, paranormal investigators, ghost hunters and YouTube personalities and every curious person with a camera. I'll invite them all here. I'll turn this barn into a tourist attraction, a curiosity, something people visit with coffee cups and skeptical smiles. They will die. Some might. And that will bring more attention. Police, media, scientists. Eventually, someone will tear down the barn board by board, catalog every timber, explain away every phenomenon with thermal cameras and electromagnetic readings and rational explanations that are wrong, but believed anyway. I stepped back from the threshold. You're ancient. You're powerful. But you're also dependent on a very specific kind of belief, the kind that requires isolation and ignorance and fear. And I'm going to flood this place with light and noise and documentation and rational skepticism. Not because it will destroy you, you're right that I can't do that, but because it will make you irrelevant. The thing stood in the doorway, its form flickering, becoming less stable. You doom whoever comes next, it said. They will not have the rules, will not have the warnings. There won't be a next owner. I'm signing the deed over to the county tomorrow, making it public land. Possibly a historical site. The barn will be preserved maybe, but surrounded by visitors and documentation and explanations. You'll still be here, but you'll be a mystery solved, not a terror respected. I walked back to my truck, turned around and took one final photograph. The barn with that thing standing in the doorway, visible now, diminished now. Just a strange figure in a dark space that could be explained away by anyone determined not to believe. Wait, the thing called out, and for the first time its voice sounded almost desperate. The covenant? There is no covenant. There never was. Just people too afraid to do anything but obey. I'm done obeying. I got in my truck and drove away. In the rearview mirror, I saw the barn door swing shut. The scarecrow in the south field was gone, post and all, like it had never existed. And as I reached the property line, the rain started again, natural and normal, just weather. The storm broke shortly after dawn. I didn't sleep. I drove straight into town and waited in the parking lot of the county office until it opened at 8 a.m. The deed transfer took 3 hours of paperwork. The clerk was confused. Land like that was valuable. Why was I donating it to the county? But I insisted. I wanted no money, no compensation. I signed every form they put in front of me, legally severing my connection to the property. When it was done, I called the local newspaper, then the State Historical Society, then every paranormal research group I could find online. By noon, I'd given 6 interviews. By evening, the story was online. Local man donates allegedly haunted property to public trust. The attention was exactly what I'd hoped for. Skeptics and believers both started contacting the county requesting access. By the end of the week, 3 different research teams had scheduled visits. I never went back to the property, but I monitored it from a distance through public records and news articles and social media posts from visitors. The barn still stood. People still heard strange sounds. Some reported feeling unwelcome, uncomfortable, afraid. But no one disappeared. No one died. Because there were always people around now. Always cameras, always documentation. The barn became a minor tourist attraction. The Holdfast Barn, Kansas's most haunted. Blog posts and YouTube videos. People taking selfies at the threshold. Ghost hunters with thermal cameras finding nothing conclusive. The mystery persisted, but the terror faded. Whatever lived there was still there. I knew that. It would always be there, lurking in geometry that didn't work, existing in the space between what was and what shouldn't be. But it was contained now, not by rules but by attention. By the mundane, dismissive interest of a skeptical public that reduced everything to entertainment. I'd broken the covenant not by destroying the barn, but by making it boring. 6 months later, I was living in Colorado, working construction, trying to pretend that Kansas was just a place I'd visited once and left behind. It didn't work. The nightmares started 3 weeks after I'd signed over the deed. Not every night, but often enough that I learned to recognize the signs, a certain quality of twilight, a particular weight to the air that meant I'd wake at 3 a.m. in cold sweat, remembering. In the dreams, I was always back at the barn, always standing at that threshold, staring into darkness that stared back, and always that voice, ageless, patient, saying, "You cannot leave. Geography is permanent." I'd wake up checking my phone, making sure I was in my Colorado apartment, hundreds of miles from Greeley County, making sure it had been a dream. But some mornings I found prairie dust on my shoes. I told myself it was impossible. Told myself it was psychological, that trauma manifested in strange ways, that my mind was playing tricks. I didn't believe it. In July, I got a call from Sheriff Porter. "Mr. Warren," he said, voice careful. "I wanted to let you know we found Judd Crowley." My heart stopped. "Where?" "In his workshop, at his own property, 6 miles from your grandfather's old place. Looks like he's been there the whole time. Died of what appears to be a heart attack." That's impossible. His truck was at the barn. I saw his truck's been in his driveway this whole time, according to neighbors. We checked the records. You never filed a missing person report, Mr. Warren. We have no documentation of any visit to investigate his disappearance. The bottom dropped out of my stomach. But I remember. You came to the property. You and Deputy Chen. You photographed his truck. You searched the area. We have no record of that visit. And Deputy Chen says she's never been to the Holdfast property in her life. Says her grandmother warned her never to go near it. I stood in my apartment, phone pressed to my ear, reality tilting around me. "Mr. Warren, are you all right? Do you need to speak with someone?" These kinds of stresses, inheriting property, especially from estranged family, they can cause false memories sometimes. I ended the call. I spent that evening searching through my phone looking for evidence. The photos I'd taken of the barn, of the things standing in the doorway, of Judd's truck. They weren't there. Every photo I'd taken on the property was gone. Not deleted. There were no gaps in the date stamps, just absent like I'd never taken them at all. But I remembered. I knew what I'd seen, didn't I? In August, I received a letter forwarded from my grandfather's property. It had been mailed to the barn itself, addressed to current Warren resident. Inside was a single sheet of aged paper with text in a handwriting I didn't recognize. Rule 12. Distance is not protection. Attention is not armor. We appreciate the visitors, but we remember you. We are patient. Geography is permanent. I burned the letter. That night I dreamed of the barn again. But this time, when I looked into the darkness, I saw myself looking back. A version of me that had opened the door, that had stepped inside, that had joined the waiting congregation in the loft. He smiled, I smiled, and said, "It's not so bad once you accept it, and you will accept it, eventually." We all do. I woke up screaming. The next day, I started researching everything I could find about the property's history. Not to understand it anymore, but to find evidence that would prove I hadn't imagined everything. What I found was worse than confirmation. The property records showed that the deed I'd signed over to the county had been rejected. A legal technicality, something about improper verification of inheritance, a clause in my grandfather's will that required the property remain in Warren hands for at least 1 year before transfer. The land was still legally mine. According to the county, I was still the owner, still bound to the property, still part of the covenant. I called the lawyer who'd handled my grandfather's estate. He had no record of any restriction on transfer. The county had no documentation of rejecting the deed, but the property records, maintained by a completely different office, showed clearly that I was still the owner. Someone was lying. Or something was changing records, or reality itself was becoming unreliable. In September, I started seeing the scarecrow, not at the barn, here in Colorado. I'd see it at the edge of parking lots, standing behind the last row of cars. On hiking trails just visible through trees. Once standing on the roof of the building across from mine, silhouetted against the sunrise. Always distant, always stationary, always watching. I told myself it was paranoia, PTSD, my mind imposing familiar fears onto ambiguous shapes. But one morning I found prairie grass growing in the crack of my apartment balcony, Kansas prairie grass, species that didn't exist in Colorado. That's when I finally accepted the truth. I hadn't broken the covenant. I'd only changed its terms. The barn couldn't hold me physically anymore, couldn't trap me with rules and boundaries. But it had marked me, claimed me. I was still connected to it, still part of its pattern, just as my grandfather had been. The only difference was that I'd tried to fight it, and in fighting I'd made the connection stronger. I'd fed it my defiance the same way others had fed it their fear, and now it followed me. In October, I decided to go back, not to stay, not to submit, but to understand. Because something had occurred to me while researching the property's history. Every owner who disappeared had tried to destroy the barn or directly confront it. Every owner who'd survived had followed the rules, but no one had ever tried to simply coexist with it, to acknowledge its existence without giving it power, to maintain boundaries without treating them as sacred. My grandfather had survived through fear and obedience. I'd tried to survive through defiance and denial. Maybe there was a third option. I drove back to Kansas on a gray November morning, arriving at the property just after dawn. The barn stood exactly as I'd left it. The county had installed a small parking area and an informational plaque, historical agricultural structure circa 1880s, that made the place look almost quaint. There were no other visitors. I walked to the barn slowly, noting the changes 6 months had brought. Someone had repaired the door hinges. The worst holes in the roof had been patched. It looked almost maintained. I stood at the threshold and called out, "I'm back." Not to stay, not to fight, just to talk. Silence. I know you're still here. I know you're following me. I know the connection wasn't broken. So let's establish new terms. The air inside the barn darkened slightly like clouds passing over the sun, though the sky was clear. I will acknowledge you, I said. I will not deny your existence or try to diminish you. But I will not fear you. And I will not obey you. We'll exist in parallel. You in your space, me in mine. We'll respect the boundaries not because one of us demands it, but because that's how coexistence works. Nothing responded, but I felt a shift in the atmosphere. A kind of attention. I'll visit once a year, I continued. I'll maintain the property from a distance, make sure it doesn't fall apart. I'll keep documentation of what you are, but I won't sensationalize it. I'll treat you like what you are. An anomaly, strange but permanent. Unknowable but manageable. I pulled out the rule sheet I'd kept, the one my grandfather had written. I read through it one last time, then set it on the barn's threshold. I'm writing new rules, I said, not for survival, for cohabitation. I pulled out a notebook and pen, and there at the barn's entrance I wrote, Rules for coexistence. 1. The barn exists, I exist. Neither will try to erase the other. 2. Annual visits required, neither friendly nor fearful, simple acknowledgement. 3. The barn stays on its property, I stay on mine. Distance respected both ways. 4. Documentation permitted, exploitation forbidden, truth but not spectacle. 5. When boundaries are unclear, communication before action. I tore out the page and set it beside my grandfather's rules. The darkness inside the barn shifted, and that familiar voice, ageless, patient, spoke one more time. Acceptable. The word hung in the air for a moment, then faded. I nodded once and walked back to my truck. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror. The barn stood quiet in the morning light, just a structure, just a place. The scarecrow had returned to the south field, arm extended, pointing at nothing, but it wasn't following me anymore. I'd found the third option. Neither submission nor defiance, but a wary, honest coexistence with something I couldn't understand or destroy. It wasn't victory. It wasn't defeat. It was simply continuation. And maybe that was the only realistic outcome when dealing with something older and stranger than human comprehension could accommodate. I still have nightmares sometimes. I still see prairie grass growing in places it shouldn't. I still feel watched occasionally, especially at twilight. But I'm not bound anymore. Not like my grandfather was, not like the others. I'm just aware. And once a year in early November, I drive back to Kansas and spend an hour at the barn. I don't enter, I don't challenge. I simply sit in my truck, engine off, acknowledging its presence. And it acknowledges mine. We coexist. It's not the ending I wanted, but it's the only honest one I could find. 3 years later, the property sold. I hadn't planned to sell. The new arrangement, wary coexistence, annual visits, mutual acknowledgement, had been working. The nightmares had faded to occasional occurrences. The sense of being watched had diminished to background noise. I'd almost convinced myself that I'd found a sustainable solution. Then the county contacted me about back taxes. Apparently, while the deed had never successfully transferred, I'd also never paid property taxes. A clerical error, they said. Some confusion in the records, multiple contradictory documents, the kind of bureaucratic tangle that could take years to sort out. Or I could just sell the property and be done with it. I hesitated. The covenant was still in effect in its new form. Annual visits, mutual respect. Could that obligation be transferred? I called Martha Hain. She was 81 now, still sharp, still living alone in that house on the edge of town. When I explained the situation, she was quiet for a long time. "You did something no one else managed," she said finally. "You changed the terms without getting consumed. That's remarkable, but also dangerous." "How so?" "Because you've proven it's possible to negotiate with that thing. And the next person who owns that land, they might try to negotiate too. But without your knowledge, without understanding how delicate the balance is. So I should keep the property?" "No." Her voice was firm. "You should do what your grandfather never could. You should let go. That's the final test, Elias. Learning to pass on the burden without guilt. But whoever buys it will have choices, just like you did, just like everyone before you. You can't save them from those choices. You can only document what you learned and hope they're smart enough to listen." So I sold the property. I updated my grandfather's documentation with everything I'd learned. I wrote about the failure of pure obedience and the failure of direct confrontation. I documented the third option, acknowledgement without submission, and the fragile peace it had created. I sealed it all in an envelope with instructions to be given to the new owner, and I walked away. The buyers were a young couple from Denver, Marcus and Jenna Green, both in their early 30s, both excited about rural property investment and sustainable farming. They'd been charmed by the historic barn and saw potential in the land. I met them once briefly during the closing. Jenna had a bright smile and talked enthusiastically about renovation plans. Marcus was quieter, more serious, but clearly committed to the project. They seemed competent, optimistic, in love. I handed them the envelope. "This is documentation from previous owners," I said, "information about the property. I strongly recommend you read it before you stay overnight." Marcus laughed. "Is this the part where you tell us it's haunted?" "It's the part where I give you information that might keep you safe." Jenna's smile faltered slightly. "You're serious?" "Very serious. Please, read it, all of it, before sunset on your first night there." They promised they would, but I saw the skepticism in their eyes. I'd probably sounded like a crazy person, or like someone trying to maintain a rural legend for atmospheric effect. I drove away from the lawyer's office with a check for $200,000, far more than the property was worth in any rational market, and a heavy certainty that I'd just made a terrible mistake. That night I called Martha Hain. "I sold it," I said. "I know. Marcus Green's mother goes to my church. They're good people. I gave them the documentation, everything, but I don't think they'll read it. Probably not. Not right away. Young people rarely believe in things they can't explain." She paused. "But they'll learn. Everyone who stays learns eventually. Will they survive? That's up to them. You did what you could, Elias. The rest is their choice." We said goodbye, and I tried to convince myself she was right. I failed. 2 weeks later, I drove back to Kansas. I told myself I was just checking in, making sure everything was okay, confirming that the new owners had settled in without incident. I parked on the road a half-mile from the property line and used binoculars to observe. The barn stood quiet. A new truck was parked near it, Marcus and Jenna's. Smoke rose from a camping area they'd established. Everything looked normal. Peaceful. I drove away, relieved and slightly embarrassed by my paranoia. 3 days later, I got a call from an unknown Kansas number. "Mr. Warren?" A woman's voice, strained and shaking. "Jenna Green." "Yes?" We need to talk about the property, about what you wrote." My stomach tightened. "What happened?" Nothing happened, but we've been hearing things, and Marcus found..." She stopped. "Can you come back, please? We don't know who else to call." "Did you read the documentation I left?" "We did. Last night. After..." She took a shaky breath. After we heard footsteps in the loft, we thought it was an animal, so Marcus went up to check, but there was nothing there. And then we found the rules in your envelope and don't enter the barn between sundown and sunrise, I said. That's rule 1. Are you following it? Yes, now, but then you're probably safe for the moment. I'll drive out tomorrow. Thank you. Thank you so much. I ended the call and sat in my Colorado apartment staring at nothing. I'd hoped the covenant would transfer with the deed, that my 3-year arrangement with the barn would simply continue with new participants. But covenants, I was learning, were personal. The barn had negotiated with me. It had accepted my terms. It hadn't agreed to anything with Marcus and Jenna. They were starting over, back at the beginning. New owners, new tests, new opportunities for the barn to expand its reach. And it was my fault. I drove through the night and arrived at the property at dawn. Marcus and Jenna were sitting in their truck looking exhausted and frightened. When they saw me, relief washed over their faces. Thank God, Marcus said. We didn't know what else to do. I looked at the barn. It appeared exactly as it had for years. Weathered wood, leaning slightly, dark gaps between boards. But the scarecrow was back. It stood in the south field exactly where it had always stood, one arm extended, pointing toward the barn. I hadn't seen it 3 days ago when I'd checked on the property. It had been gone since I'd established the new covenant. Now, it was back. Tell me everything, I said. They explained. They'd arrived excited, spent the first day planning renovations. The first night they'd heard footsteps in the barn loft, but assumed it was an animal. The second night, Marcus had entered the barn after dark to retrieve a tool he'd left inside. The door was locked, Marcus said, from the inside, but I hadn't locked it. And when I finally got it open, I saw... He trailed off. What did you see? Someone standing in the loft, just a silhouette, watching me. What did you do? I left, fast, and I found your envelope. Jenna had set it aside without reading it, and we spent the whole night reading everything you'd written. I nodded slowly. The barn is testing you, like it tested me, like it's tested every owner. You entering after dark was a violation of Rule 1. You've demonstrated that you don't yet understand the boundaries, so it's escalating. But you wrote that you'd established a new arrangement, Jenna said, that you'd negotiated with it. Can't we do the same? That covenant was with me. It doesn't automatically transfer to new owners. You'd need to establish your own terms. How? I looked at the barn, at the scarecrow, at the prairie stretching empty in every direction. I don't know if you can, I said honestly. I had years of gradual experience before I attempted negotiation. I understood the patterns. You're starting from zero and you've already made a mistake. The barn might see you as easier to manipulate than I was. Or it might be more aggressive because it's been constrained for 3 years and wants to reassert itself. Marcus looked at Jenna. Some silent communication passed between them. We can't afford to walk away, Jenna said. We invested everything in this property. I'll buy it back, I said immediately. For what you paid plus 20%, you'll make a profit. We signed a non-refundable inspection waiver, Marcus said quietly. If we try to sell this quickly, we'll lose everything, and honestly, he looked at the barn. I don't think it will let us leave. He was probably right. I spent the day with them, going through the rules line by line, explaining the patterns I'd observed, sharing everything I'd learned about coexistence. As sunset approached, we retreated to their truck, parked a safe distance from the barn, engine running just as I'd done years ago. This is insane, Jenna whispered. We bought a farm. We were going to grow vegetables and raise chickens and live a simple life. How is this real? I don't know, I said, but it is. And now you have to decide. Do you try to fight it, follow the old rules, or find your own accommodation with it? As full darkness fell, the footsteps began. Marcus and Jenna grabbed each other's hands, staring at the barn. "What's walking up there?" Marcus asked. "I don't know," I said. "I never looked directly." "That was Rule 3, but others who violated it..." I thought about the figure I'd seen in the doorway, assembled from darkness. They described something that used to be human-shaped but forgot how. The footsteps paced back and forth, that familiar rhythm. At 1:03 a.m. the knocking began. Marcus jerked. "What is that?" "Rule 5, don't open the door, don't respond, no matter what voice it uses." We sat in silence, listening to the slow, methodical knocking. Then Marcus, "Jenna, it's me, Elias. I'm trapped in the barn. They locked me in. Please, you have to help me." My own voice, perfect in every detail, calling from inside the barn. Jenna looked at me, sitting beside her in the truck, then back at the barn. "But you're here." "It learns fast," I said quietly. "It's already figured out that you trust me." "Marcus, please," my voice called from the barn. "It's so cold. Don't leave me like this." Marcus's hand moved toward the truck door. "Don't," I said sharply. "That's not me. I'm here. That's just sound arranged to manipulate you." The knocking continued. My voice pleaded. Then changed to Jenna's mother, then Marcus's father, cycling through loved ones with casual cruelty. We endured it together until 1:47 a.m., when the sounds finally stopped. In the silence that followed, Jenna said, "We can't live like this." "No," I agreed, "you can't. Not without understanding what you're coexisting with." "Then teach us," Marcus said. "Stay. For a week, a month, however long it takes. Help us establish our own terms." I looked at him, at Jenna, at these two people who'd been unlucky enough to buy a property that came with obligations they couldn't have imagined. And I made a decision I knew I'd regret. "1 month," I said. "I'll stay for 1 month. I'll teach you everything I know. But after that, you're on your own. I can't be the interpreter between you and that thing forever." They agreed, and so I moved back to the Kansas property I'd tried so hard to leave. For 4 weeks, I lived in their truck while they lived in mine, rotating shifts, maintaining constant vigilance. I taught them the rhythms of the barn's behavior, the patterns of escalation, the subtle signs that indicated when it was testing versus when it was merely present. They learned faster than I had. Fear is an excellent teacher. By the end of the month, they'd established a routine. Never enter after dark. Never respond to voices. Maintain respectful distance without showing fear. Acknowledge the barn's presence without worshiping it. They didn't love the arrangement, but they accepted it. On my final night, I sat with them outside the barn at sunset, and Jenna said, "Will we survive this?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "But you have a better chance than most. You're taking it seriously. You're working together. And you're not alone. If you need help, call me. I'll always answer." I meant it. I drove away the next morning, watching the barn shrink in my rearview mirror, and tried to convince myself I'd done enough. 6 months later, I got a message from Jenna, just 2 words. "It's moving." I called immediately. No answer. I called again and again. On the 4th attempt, Marcus picked up. "The scarecrow," he said without preamble. "It's not in the south field anymore." "Where is it?" "Closer. It's been moving every night, a few feet each time. Last week it was 50 yards from the barn. Tonight it's 15 feet from our camping area." "Have you acknowledged it? Like I taught you?" "We've tried, but I don't think it's listening. I think..." His voice dropped. "I think it wants new terms. And I don't think those terms include both of us." The line went quiet except for wind noise. "Marcus, one of us will have to leave," he said finally. That's what we figured out. The barn accepted you alone. It might accept one of us, but not both. It doesn't like partnerships, doesn't like people supporting each other. It's already started trying to turn us against each other. Jenna hears my voice from the barn saying terrible things. I hear her voice. We're starting to doubt each other, even though we know it's manipulation. He exhaled shakily. We're not going to make it, not together. Leave, I said urgently. Both of you, right now, just walk away. We tried. The truck won't start, and when we tried to walk to the road, we ended up back at the barn 3 times. It's not letting us leave together. I drove back to Kansas that night. When I arrived at dawn, I found only Marcus. Where's Jenna? He pointed at the barn. The door was open. She went inside? 30 minutes ago, she said one of us had to make a choice and she was making it. She told me to drive away and not look back. Tears ran down his face. She walked into the barn and the door closed behind her. I can't open it. I've tried everything. I approached the barn slowly, dread building with each step. The door was closed but not latched. I pushed it gently. It swung open. Inside, the barn was empty. Completely empty. No old hay bales, no rusted equipment, no collapsed loft. Just a vast, dark space that seemed to extend much further back than the barn's exterior dimensions should allow. And in that darkness, very far away, a single figure stood facing away from me. Jenna? I called. The figure didn't turn, didn't respond. I stepped back and let the door close. Marcus was standing behind me. Is she? I don't know. But I did know. The barn had claimed her. Not killed. The barn didn't kill, not exactly, but claimed. Made part of itself. Added to that congregation of wrong-shaped figures in the loft. She'd made the sacrifice Marcus couldn't. Had walked in voluntarily, establishing terms through the oldest method, offering herself. And in return, the barn had released Marcus. His truck started on the first try when he turned the key. Go, I told him. Right now. Don't pack. Don't look back, just drive. But Jenna is beyond help. The only thing you can do now is survive. That's what she chose. Honor it. Marcus drove away and I stood alone in the prairie dawn, staring at the barn. The scarecrow had returned to its original position in the south field. The door was closed again. Everything looked exactly as it had years ago when I'd first inherited the property. The cycle had completed. A new owner claimed, a new sacrifice made, the barn satisfied for another period of dormancy. And me, still trapped in its orbit, still unable to fully leave. Still bound by a covenant I'd thought I'd renegotiated but had only postponed. I got in my truck and drove back to Colorado, but I knew with absolute certainty that one day the barn would call me back again. Because geography is permanent, and some debts can only be delayed, never paid.